The US economy has shrunk by nearly 5%, ending the longest expansion in US history, as coronavirus virtually shut down the country. The gross domestic product figures show a 4.8% fall for the first quarter of the year. That's the sharpest drop since the financial crisis of 2008. Well, the latest figures from the Department of Commerce account only for the first 3 months of the year, which means figures for the next quarter are expected to be even more dramatic. Lindsey Piegza is chief economist at Stifel. That's a wealth management and investment banking firm. She joins me now from Minneapolis. So in many ways, this is the tip of the iceberg. I'm just wondering how the United States, particularly Donald Trump, will react to this.
Well, as you mentioned, a near 5% drop, while hardly unexpected, does certainly solidify the notion that the U.S. economy was already heading into recession at the start of the year. And this is before the hardest hit is expected to come in the second quarter, with most forecasts expecting a 30% drop when we look out to the second quarter. So this was a small decline as expected, but hardly the worst to come when we talk about a forced economic shutdown stalling nearly every industry in the U.S. economy.
And I think the Fed is due to meet again shortly. They've already slashed interest rates, they're relaxing banking rules, they're also dramatically expanding lending. What more can they do?
At this point, we don't expect much to be announced from the Fed. As you mentioned, rates are already at zero. They have committed to unlimited asset purchases, and we now have a series, I believe we're up to 9, lending and liquidity programs. So there's not much expected from the Fed in terms of additional policy initiatives, but we do expect to hear from the Fed regarding how those policies have succeeded in terms of stabilizing the U.S. market and whether or not they do expect to take further policy measures if weakness persists beyond the first half of the year.
A lot of focus on the difference between state, federal and local government and how they're responding to this. And where is the real pressure falling here?
Well, right now, this is a very localized response. Different states have different levels of cases, and it is incumbent on those local and state governments to respond accordingly. The federal government has put out general advisories, general guidelines, but it is on the state and local governments to determine how to implement those guidelines and whether or not we see some of those restrictions beginning to lift, as we have seen in Georgia, Colorado, and a handful of other states here in the U.S.
The ramifications of the job losses are huge, particularly in America, because as well as losing your job, you also lose your health insurance, don't you?
Absolutely. And so what we've seen is the federal government step in with trillions of dollars trying to help stem that shortfall for businesses and workers. As you mentioned, we've seen nearly 26 million Americans file for initial jobless claims. So the federal government has not only extended that program, but also expanded coverage for Americans in terms of health care, getting access to testing, and making sure that individuals who have been forced out of their position as a result of an attempt to contain COVID-19 are not left in the dark.
What is this all doing in terms of President Trump's profile, his image in the United States? Given what's going on, given the personal controversy that surrounds him, particularly over those bleach comments, is there anything he can do? We're all waiting for his next tweet to see how he responds to this.
Well, I think in the U.S. there's a general sense of frustration, not necessarily aimed at President Trump directly, but at government officials in totality because of the lack of response, because of the slow nature of the response, which, to be fair, we didn't have enough information early on. And so government officials did respond the best that they could with the information they had. But for the general American public, there still is a very high level of frustration, particularly as we see businesses closed, workers forced to stay home, and as I mentioned, nearly 26 million Americans now filing for first-time unemployment insurance.
Lindsey Piegza, thank you so much for joining us there from Minneapolis. Thanks.
Thank you.